Then There's California, a podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their legislative priorities, policies, and other related issues that help make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. When California's sweeping legislation on plastic waste was signed by Governor Newsom in the last days of June, the bill and the collaborative and what became also an urgent process to make it come together and to make it law were all heralded as a transformative shift that may redefine how government and industry and NGOs can work together to achieve transformative public policy. California is already the national tentpole for regulating plastics. Still, more comprehensive plastics recycling and waste reduction legislation has eluded lawmakers. But success finally came this past summer, when the legislature and the environmental advocates and the plastics industry itself joined together to craft a policy compromise that kept a more stringent plastics initiative known as the Anti-Plastics Measure off of the November 2022 ballot. On this edition of Then There's California, we'll talk about the legislative blood, sweat, and tears that led to the passage and the signing into law of a historic sweeping measure that aims to dramatically shrink the amount of disposable packaging and food waste that Californians use in their daily lives, prompts changes in the plastics industry far beyond the state's borders, and calls for reducing plastics production into the future. State Senator Ben Allen represents California's 26th Senate District, covering the West Side, Hollywood, and the Coastal Bay communities of Los Angeles County, a district he grew up in. Since being elected to the State Senate in 2014, Senator Allen has authored extraordinary laws in a variety of areas, from electoral reform, preserving the arts and humanities, and, of course, environmental recovery and preservation. And for the purposes of this conversation, it is good to note that he is the chair of the Senate Environmental Quality Committee, and he co-chairs the legislature's Environmental Caucus. Senator Allen has joined us on this podcast in the past, mostly talking about plastics recycling, and we'll focus a bit later on how this effort has consumed so much of his legislative bandwidth in the past several years. But he has also talked with us on one of my favorite previous podcast episodes about being a Senate dad to his then 6-month-old and now very much growing up son, Ezra. Glad to have him back with us post-pandemic. Senator Allen, good to see you again.
It's great to be back. And he's 3.5 now, coming on 4.
How's he doing, by the way?
He's great. He's a good kid. I will say it's a lot more fun now that we can have real conversations.
Yes.
He's developed a personality, and he asks me lots of questions, and he's got a lot of perspectives, and that's only going to get more and more as time goes on. So I'm enjoying this stage of fatherhood.
That's wonderful. I'm glad to know the family's doing well. And it's been a minute, as they say, since you and I have been together since pre-pandemic.
I know.
Your life, I'm sure, is like everybody else's, has gone through its own cycles of crazy and concern and joy and everything else. How you doing, by the way?
Things are okay. Yeah, it has been a weird time, but we're all hanging in there and trying our best. But it's a strange moment in history right now, and
yes.
I think we're all experiencing that in all sorts of different ways.
Well, speaking of strange moments in history and all the work that you are doing, just to get into this conversation, there was a former legislator that once remarked that as lawmakers in a term-limited partisan atmosphere, one can really only hope to have an impact or make changes on the fringes or at the edges of public policy or law. To heal the environment, to end poverty as we know it, that you have to come at it at the fringes and incrementally. But you seem to be defying that adage every day with so much of your work, particularly on this issue of plastics.
Yeah, I think there's a place for incrementalism, and actually on this particular topic, we took both approaches. We recognized that there was the need for a more comprehensive solution, but that there was also value associated with incrementalism. And so we had smaller bills that we kept pushing, even as we were pushing for the bigger, more comprehensive bill. And in a strange way, they dovetailed nicely with each other. The smaller bills created awareness. The members of the legislature and stakeholders had to grapple with the issues that we were trying to resolve. And I think it actually helped to tee up the eventual passage of the bigger measure. But of course, you're never going to end poverty with one wave of a wand. But you're starting to see, even in Washington, which is so notoriously unable to come together these days, they were able to just pass a very substantive, massive measure relating to climate and a number of other infrastructural needs. We've certainly seen our ability to do that here in the legislature. It doesn't happen all the time, but it is still out there as a possibility, and we just need to keep working toward it. And part of it has to do with dogged, focused approach that really is both tactical, that tries to find ways of addressing all the different stakeholders' concerns, constant conversation with people across the aisle. And that's one of the many things I'm proud of that we were able to accomplish here. This was truly a bipartisan effort and a multi-sectoral effort, and a lot went behind it. But we need to be looking for these kinds of opportunities all the time as legislators.
Well, when you say a lot went behind it, we'll get into the details of SB 54, but first give us kind of a top-line recollection and description. And I talked about how this consumed so much of your legislative and personal and intellectual bandwidth over the last 3 or 4 years, and just now leading up to this past summer, the 11th hour achievement, this consensus on really what is a complicated, albeit historical piece of legislation. Walk us back a little bit to where we are now.
Yeah, and of course the crazy thing about being a legislator is that you always have so many priorities and so many issues, and this certainly has been a major focus for me. But one of the other challenges is getting a massive bill like this across the finish line while you're also focused on district budgetary priorities, all the other bills that you have, my chairmanship, other bills on all sorts of different topics that I was pushing, and of course evaluating my colleagues, all the issues in the district. So there's so many things happening all the time. I wish I could have only spent my time on this one issue, but it really certainly took up a ton of attention and bandwidth. And I do tip my hat to so much of my staff, but certainly to Tina Andolina, the staffer who really did jockey this every step of the way. Basically, this is an issue that has really risen to the forefront for local communities in California ever since China declared their national sword policy. It used to be that we would send so much of our recycling material off to China. The shipping containers would come filled with goods from China, and they would show up in the ports in California, and they actually needed something to fill the shipping containers back with, to send back. And of course, we ended up using the opportunity to put recycling materials into those shipping containers and sending them back to China. But of course, we were living a bit of a lie. More and more plastic entering into the waste stream, more and more plastic contaminating the paper stream, and more plastic that wasn't truly recyclable. And so much of that plastic ended up in rivers and streams, incinerated in China, such that it got to a point where the Chinese finally said, hey, enough is enough. We don't want your junk anymore. Right. This is just not working for us. It's becoming an environmental disaster. It's not penciling out. Right. So we're going to put the kibosh on here. We're going to bring down the national sword, as they called it, and we're going to stop taking this material. And overnight, what used to be a moneymaker for our local communities suddenly became a major financial burden. In our cities, we're suddenly having to come up with new solutions for dealing with this enormous wave of plastic that were within our waste streams. And that was leading to really difficult decisions, more and more money having to go into putting Band-Aid solutions, such as expanding landfills, which actually is expensive, local communities having to raise waste hauler rates over and over again on regular Californians. So much of this material ending up in our rivers and streams. An annual $500 million being spent every year on litter cleanup alone here in the state of California. That's taxpayer dollars that could have been going to better causes. And all of this based on a system where the producers have just no skin in the game, no accountability associated with the end use of their products. And of course, it's those producers that really do have the most tools at their disposal as to how these products will ultimately be used. And just to give you one little example, there was a detergent bottle manufacturer that changed the resin type of this particular bottle. And that one little decision, I think it was made for aesthetic reasons, rendered that product totally non-recyclable. It used to be recycled, and now it was heading to the landfill. And we were all picking up the tab for that. And so it really became abundantly clear to me that this really did require a governmental solution. Now, we put a bill forward back in 2019 and then again in 2020, and we came excruciatingly close to getting a major bill across the finish line in both cases. Just weren't able to get there. A bunch of activists and some folks in the private sector who were so frustrated with the lack of action on the part of the legislature finally said, we don't have confidence in the legislature. We're going to put the resources together to put a ballot measure on the ballot. And they came forward with a ballot measure. And interestingly, that created the context for us to engage in an intensive 9-month-long negotiation between stakeholders from the environmental community, from local government, and from industry, sitting around the table, trying to hash out a solution, trying to see if we can come up with some sort of legislative solution instead of having the ballot measure go onto the ballot, which would have been unpredictable, it would have been incredibly costly. And we actually thought maybe we could come up with something better This deal died 9 times, no question about it, both when it was at the negotiating table and then when it got sent out into the world, and all of the feeding frenzy, the new feeding frenzy began with all sorts of different interest groups and organizations weighing in, attacking parts of it, supporting other parts of it. And then it died another 9 times as we tried to get this thing across the finish line in the legislature. But it was an arduous process, fascinating process, but one that ultimately was successful.
And again, it wasn't even a legislative deadline you were dealing with in June. It was a ballot deadline.
That's exactly
you were
right.
really at the 11th hour, the stroke of midnight, to get the bill to the governor, or get an agreement into legislative form and to the governor in order to have this proposition removed from the ballot so that it was all being done legislatively.
It wasn't the stroke of midnight, but it was literally the last day. We were on the
Yes.
last day to make this decision. And even after it passed,
Yes.
it was still unclear as to whether everything would come together with the ballot signatories. And so, yeah, it was a wild last couple of weeks. The deadline was 5 p.m. that day, and I think we got it all taken care of by about 2 p.m. But I will say that it was very nice to be at a June deadline instead of the last couple of years where we were at the end of session where everything was a deadline.
Right.
And so the bill was then getting leveraged for other causes and needs and issues that typically happen at the August 31st or September 15th deadline. So I at least didn't have to deal with all that, Michigas.
Yeah. Well, let's get into the details, though. So explain this perfect yet fragile balance of recycling mandate, industry incentive and accountability, the shifting of the fiscal responsibility, and this really historic reduction of plastic's impact on our environment now and moving forward that make up the guts, the meat of SB 54.
Yeah. So the idea here is that we are creating extended producer responsibility. I talked about that detergent bottle.
Yes.
We're now saying to the producers, look, guys, you guys have control over your products, their design, their use, and ultimately their end use, much more than the average consumer, certainly much more than the waste hauling industry or local cities. So under our bill, the producers will be required to create organizations that will ensure that their products and packaging meet aggressive rates and deadlines for waste reduction, recyclability, reusability, and compostability. And if they're not able to meet those requirements, then their products are ultimately going to be banned from the market. That's the core concept here, extended producer responsibility for meeting these rates and dates with a focus on waste reduction, recyclability, reusability, and compostability. That's the top line concept.
Mm-hmm. And also, unlike in the past, there's more focus this time around on attention to disadvantaged communities in the state that have to bear the biggest impact of dealing with plastics production and pollution.
There's no question about it. There's a good chunk of funding coming out of this that will go to address the very real concerns and issues relating to disadvantaged communities. We know that those disadvantaged communities typically bear the biggest brunt associated with both plastic pollution and plastic production and the end use of plastic, the dumps, the MRFs, the recycling facilities, the sorting facilities, etc. So these are the communities that are typically closer to industrial zones where a lot of the trash is being collected, where the dumps are, where the recycling facilities are. They're ultimately left with the burden, very little compensation associated with mitigation. So we're going to make sure that they have money to mitigate against the corrosive impacts of plastic pollution over the years. And of course, here's another thing to mention. As the bill has shifted so much of the responsibility for managing the system over to the producers, the cost shift associated, currently the cost being borne by cities and local communities and ratepayers, that cost shift will benefit cities tremendously. It's the cities who are left holding the bag under the current system, and cities, of course, have been forced to make tough choices as to whether to raise rates or shift resources away from other local priorities in order to manage this increasingly challenging system. So there's another great benefit associated with the bill there.
Even just from the beginning on through your journey through this plastics reduction and recycling process, there's been the skepticism about the industry's role and the industry's intent. They were strongly opposed to the ballot measure, and that actually was the catalyst for them to help pass or reach agreement on SB 54, but you have called out the industry in the past about their absolute lack of accountability in dealing with plastic waste up till now, as you already talked about. And there were still some influencers in this process that the phrase was holding their nose on SB 54 as it was finalized because they still view the industry with suspicion and are concerned that they still have too much power in this process, like the fox guarding the hen house a little bit.
Yeah, except that the difference is that the amount of power and the accountability measures that we put into the bill, empowering the CalRecycle department and this advisory board that will be made up of stakeholders, including important environmental and environmental justice voices and local government voices, who will be helping to drive and direct and hold accountable the producer responsibility organizations. It is CalRecycle, with the engagement of this advisory committee, that will be approving the plans, holding the producer responsibility organizations accountable to the plans. Real strong teeth associated with fines and also the ultimate ability to prevent industry from selling their products onto the market. So that's very real. I mean, CalRecycle will have the power to fine producers $50,000 per product, per violation, per day. That is a very serious stick. Mm-hmm. And that's something, by the way, when you look at previous extended producer responsibility systems, that we learned from the mistakes of the past. Mm-hmm. And we've been able to incorporate some of the learnings from those experiences into this bill. And I will say the other beauty of this is, I know there are a lot of the folks that you just mentioned that I think would prefer a command and control system where some bureaucrat in a building in Sacramento tells industry exactly what to do. Mm-hmm. Not only, of course, would that have been so much harder to pass through this legislature. I mean, let's kind of face the political realities of that. We tried something along those lines, and that just failed. But I would actually argue that the way we have it structured is better. It actually works better. It's more likely, now that we have industry buy-in, industry has a seat at the table to help to come up with solutions, but it's not voluntary. They have to come up with the solutions, but they know their products best. I'll bring up an example that I often bring up in the case of the automobiles. We told automobile manufacturers back in the 70s, when kids were growing up with half of the lung capacity in South LA because of how bad the smog was, half of the lung capacity of kids growing up in rural parts of the country, we told the automobile producers, look, you got to do better. We knew that they had the tools to do better, by the way. It just was a matter of scaling. It was a matter of doubling down on the R&D. But we're going to hold you accountable to aggressive emissions reductions, pollution reductions, smog reductions coming out of your cars. And they kicked and screamed, but they were ultimately able to comply. Of course, those companies that were ahead of the curve on the research and development benefited. But in the end of the day, they complied. We have many, many more cars on the road in Los Angeles. All you got to do is try to get behind the wheel in West LA at 4:45
on the 405. Yes,
I mean, it's unbelievable. But the air is significantly cleaner. You can actually see the Hollywood sign. You couldn't used to see the Hollywood sign on a typical day in the 70s because of how bad the smog was. So many, many more cars on the road, much more congestion, and much cleaner air. So what we're doing here is by pushing the industry to ask these questions about their products, by forcing them to ask these questions about their products, to force market creation and consideration of end use, industry is going to get increasingly creative about every aspect of the supply chain, from production design to collection and sorting to recycling the product into something new. We're also going to help to build up markets for investment in those areas, and that's going to have a follow-on effect, not just in California, but also globally. As first of all, other jurisdictions are starting to feel the same pinch that we felt, both environmental and just the logistical pinch associated with waste management and landfills and all the rest. This is also going to help to build out a real investment system in the next generation of innovative products. We're not telling business that they have to get rid of packaging and products. We just say we're telling them they have to do their work in a more sustainable way. I say that in the end of the day, the best system involves business helping us to come up with the solutions. They're the ones who know their products and their customers and their markets the best. But I totally agree that this is meaningless unless we have strong teeth and strong accountability measures. And that's part of why we work so hard to ensure that the CalRecycle would have the power that it has under the bill to hold industry accountable to meeting these aggressive rates and dates.
And once again, California becomes the tentpole for so much of this that can influence how the industry operates in other states as well as federally.
That's exactly right. I've said every step of the way, including in the earlier iteration of the bill, that I would consider this entire effort to be a failure if this was something that was only confined to California. So much of what we're doing here both involves improving the lot of life for Californians and Californian cities and California ratepayers and California's environment, but also we know that we will be making such a contribution to our global environment if we help to drive innovation in this area in ways that will help reduce pollution and make life better for people all over the world.
Talk about the coalition that came together here in the 11th hour that you've been working with for quite a while here to make this current version of SB 54 a reality, a bipartisan coalition, including with industry, kind of strange bedfellows in some ways, groups that might otherwise be opposed on these kind of things. Talk about the coalition and how you guys all came together to make this happen.
Yeah, so it was a big group of folks. Obviously, there were so many different voices that have to be a part of this conversation. On the advocacy side, local government, of course, was at the heart of this because local government, as I say, has been bearing the brunt of this challenge and the costs. We had many environmental groups, environmental justice folks involved in the conversation. You know, some of the bigger name environmental groups that folks know about. Oceana was the leader of this conversation, but it also involved the Ocean Conservancy, the Nature Conservancy, but nearly every environmental organization that you know of at least weighed in to some extent or another, including the environmental justice community, in terms of what ended up ultimately emerging in the final version of the bill. On the industry side, of course, lots of voices as well. The conversation led by the Chamber of Commerce, but within industry, there were so many different voices and so many different perspectives. Manufacturers, the plastics industry, of course, the haulers and the waste management people, the recyclers, the retailers, the restaurants, the shops and the grocers, the agricultural industry, the consumer products, the beverage containers. I mean, the number of voices at the table was tremendous.
Sure.
You know, when people talk about the recent micro deal that we were able to strike and what a great achievement that was. I mean, for people who don't know, this was an issue relating to basically medical tort reform. The whole issue of medical malpractice cases and finally reaching a deal on that issue. When that negotiation happened, there were only about 6 groups around the table. Right? It was the trial attorneys and basically the medical establishment. In our case, there were literally hundreds of different, very engaged stakeholders that had very strong opinions about what we ought to do. And this was ultimately an enormous compromise. By the way, there's no way we would have gotten this done without the ballot measure in this form. I mean, right. At least the ballot measure did create such an impetus.
Well, that's interesting because somebody said that SB 54 was the perfect example of the initiative process actually working because the looming presence of the ballot measure was the stick that got the legislature to do its job and all parties working together legislatively.
It focused everyone's attention in a very serious way. And, of course, in the end of the day, the ballot measure signatories, they were real believers in their ballot measure. And part of why this thing really did go down to the 11th hour is because it was never clear until the very end that the ballot measure signatories were going to pull back. You know, and in the end of the day, this thing only happened because they agreed, in the end of the day, that our bill was strong enough to merit their decision to pull back the ballot measure from the ballot. But they really had to be convinced, and ultimately we actually made some changes at the end that pushed the bill further in the environmental direction so as to get them to a place where they felt comfortable pulling back the ballot measure. You know, and that was one of many wild aspects of this process.
Actually, to that point, in our last podcast conversation back in 2019 about plastics, again, when you were dealing with that incarnation of SB 54 at the time, you told me a story about a text exchange that you'd had with one of your colleagues in the Assembly when that bill was being debated in the lower house in the Assembly, and it was somebody that you were not counting on to vote for the bill initially, but you considered him a kind guy, a sensible guy, and you thought he might still be open, and you wanted to do your due diligence and give him all the information, and you told him you were ready to answer any questions, and you gave him documents, and he said, thanks, appreciate it. The next morning, you were sitting on the floor, and he came up to you behind your shoulder, and he told you that he had thought about you and your son, and he said he figured it was because of your son that you were fighting passionately for this bill. So he told you, hey, I'm going to vote for the bill because at the end of the day, we're all human beings, and we all have our priorities and what is our passion and what compels us to do this work. Any kind of those moments in this coalition building and in this action here in the last couple of months and in those last 24 hours before the bill came out?
You know, through this whole process, there were certainly many ugly moments, but there were many beautiful moments as well. And that certainly stands out as one of the many beautiful moments that I experienced through this process. I guess what I would say to you, Brian, is yes, there were. One of the interesting things to see was how, I mean, granted, it took a ballot measure to get this conversation going with the business community. But I think the folks on the business side were genuinely excited to be part of a real solution, to not just be out there trying to kill environmental bills. This situation created an atmosphere, created an environment where they could actually sit down with the environmental community and sit down with their partners from local government and come up with a mutually agreeable solution that both met the core needs of business within this context, but that also met the core needs of our broader society and of our children and of our environment. And I think a number of them, including the lead negotiator on the business side who just had a little baby himself, I think they took a great deal of satisfaction to finally be part of a solution, not just out there killing bills. We recognized each other's mutual humanity. As much as they may be fighting like real professionals for their clients, they also have children too. They have a stake in this future. They care about our environment as well. And I think it was very gratifying for them to be a part of a solutions-based process, as difficult as it was. And so a lot of the process also involved recognition of our mutual humanity and our mutual goals. And that was another thing that I really liked about this process. Because of the ballot measure hanging out there, business always knew that they had to come up with something really meaningful on the environment side, or else this thing would never move. And so they had to use every skill they had to both understand their clients' needs while also understanding the imperative environmental goals that we had. And it was just gratifying to be a part of a process that was so solutions-driven for such a good cause.
And it's interesting to think about the impact that this bill will have on various allied industries. And what makes me think of that is there was an article in Vogue magazine this month, which I actually just saw last night, detailing how the fashion industry will need to rethink everything from e-commerce packaging to how clothes are displayed in stores. Talk about taking on big industries like pharmaceuticals and getting them to be responsible for packaging. Now it's fashion industry, it's the beauty industry, cosmetics, skincare, lotion, shampoos that will either need to be made with a higher percentage of recycled plastic and also be recyclable. And you think, wow, hadn't thought of that. But it really shows how much of this bill is a game changer and how ubiquitous plastics are in our life.
100%. But just like with so many, with the car conversation, this is an opportunity. I mean, that's the beauty of the way we've crafted this bill. This is an opportunity for our best businesses, our innovators, to sit down with their top design specialists, with their scientists, with their marketing people, and actually start to incorporate these questions of sustainability into their product design, and doing so in a way that doesn't sacrifice the consumer experience. They just haven't been forced to have that conversation before. It's been too cheap and too easy to just take the easy route by buying these virgin plastics and continuing to push all this virgin plastic on the market. But now this gives an opportunity here for innovators. And that's an exciting thing too. And I think the beauty of all this is that, like the fashion industry, just like so many industries, after they get over the initial grumble about having to change, they're getting to work, just like those car companies got to work developing the next generation of lower polluting vehicles. They're getting to work coming up with the new next generation of fashion products that are going to be so much more environmentally friendly. Mm-hmm. And by the way, that will deepen their tie, their bond, their covenant with their customers and the governments that they work with and the market in a way that I think is so much more wholesome. And so it's a wonderful thing to start to see the creative, innovative gears get into motion in so many different business sectors as a result of this bill.
Blue sky, big picture here, and not to continually cast shade on the industry, to its credit, who came to the table with you to craft SB 54. There was a former EPA regulator, and I think who's now with one of the coalitions that's been working on this issue, who wrote in, actually I think it was this spring in Atlantic Magazine, she wrote that though Americans support recycling, and though some materials can be effectively recycled and safely made from recycled contents, plastics recycling does not work and will never work. That there are way too many types of plastics. Plastics are flammable, recycling them is not economical, and that the industry has waged a decades-long campaign to perpetuate the myth that it is recyclable, like the tobacco companies came out and said filtered cigarettes are healthier than unfiltered cigarettes. So are these comments too much of a cry of despair, just a cautionary note, call to future action? What do you think?
No, these comments are at the heart of our bill, the motivation of the bill. We are calling industry's bluff with this bill. We have aggressive recycling rates and dates. If they can meet those rates and dates, if they can finally make the promises and the claims that you just mentioned a reality, then sure, go ahead and continue with your business model. But the regulator you just mentioned is absolutely correct. There has not been any effectuation of those recycling claims except in the water bottle industry. In the area of the water bottle industry, only here in California and a couple other states has it even come close to meeting the recycling rates that it should. I mean, I think it's about 70% here in California. A lot of states is at 30%. We all know it can and should be over 95%. There's no reason why we're not at those levels. but they just haven't been forced to. So our bill is calling their bluff, providing them with an opportunity to truly meet these aggressive recycling rates. But if they're not able to do them, they have to find another path, or their products are going to be off the market, or they're starting to get hit with these massive fines. So we're asking them to waste reduce, source reduce, right? That's something that nobody else in the world has implemented. It basically calls for a percentage reduction of the amount of stuff that's being pushed out onto the market. We have these aggressive recycling rates. And so they're either going to have to really meet these aggressive rates, or these products are going to have to be compostable, or they're going to have to move toward other much more environmentally friendly products. So I agree with the regulator. Those concerns are at the heart of this bill. It's because that regulator is right that this whole system is so broken. The plastic has not been getting recycled. The cities and ratepayers have been bearing the burden. We're now calling their bluff and holding them accountable to either fundamentally transforming recycling or, as I guess what's going to happen, move toward more sustainable packaging writ large.
Final thoughts here, looking forward. You and the coalition deserve as many victory laps as you want to take on SB 54, but there's still so much work to be done. I know you agree with that. Recycling markets need to be looked at, technologies overall, reforms of the bottle recycling process. I know that your colleague, Senator Wieckowski's been working on that. Glass recycling, electronic vehicle batteries recycling, creating the coherence, as you have called it, for the various items going into the waste stream. And then the bigger picture, of course, there's climate change, the debate over the fossil fuels. You and your colleagues still have so much work. Just your reflections as you shake hands on SB 54 and move forward with the rest of this. What do you think?
Well, that's a lot there.
I know.
Yes. No, but listen, Brian, you're absolutely right. We have to be working on all these levels. And the thing, when you pass a big bill like this, it actually ends up opening up more boxes.
Oh, we did this. Now, what about this?
Right.
Yeah.
So actually, I just in the summer recess, after we passed 54, a group of us, including Senator Wieckowski, went on a big recycling and waste management trip to Maine and to Quebec. And it was just fantastic. We visited everything from a glass bottling plant where they take in the cullet, the glass recycled material, turn it into new bottles. We went to a plastics plant. We went to, learned about cans, composting facilities, lithium-ion battery, where they take in car batteries and they're now separating out the materials and recycling. So there's so much low-hanging fruit in this area. I mean, particularly in the area you bring up glass and just our waste streams and the fact that we single stream everything and everything cross-contaminates and makes it much harder for us to actually make the recycling work. The beauty of 54 is that it's actually now going to really create much more of an incentive for people to fulfill the recyclability, to effectuate the recyclability of these items as opposed to just the theoretical recyclability of these items. So Senator Wieckowski has his bottle bill, and the pro tem certainly been working in this space as well. Partly it was an act of desperate. Finally, the wine industry came to the table after hemming and hawing for years and years because they need the glass cullet. I mean, it's harming their business model. The distressingly low amount of the glass that's out in our market actually ends up recycled and ends up back in their systems to create the new generation of glass bottles. Glass is 100% recyclable, by the way, forever, if you can actually collect the glass and turn it into a next generation glass bottle. And yet that's not been happening because of the dysfunction of our system. By the way, the Italians have glass recycling rates at like 95%. We're hovering around 50, maybe a little bit less. So it's sad to know how this incredibly recyclable material is not actually getting recycled.
Well, in fact, most of the EU is moving forward in that regard.
They're doing so much better than we are. So certainly these are all examples of where we need to make progress. The fact that we were able to come together on 54 was a reflection of a deeper understanding of the systemic problems that a lot of the legislators had not really been forced to grapple with before. And now they actually came together to show the world that in a bipartisan manner, which is very unusual these days, that we're serious about both this pollution and the systemic problem. It's both impacting our health, our environment, our planet, but also our pocketbooks. So I'm hopeful that also as the system rolls out, people will start to, we've now broken the seal a little bit on this idea of extended producer responsibility, that now the legislature has agreed with the idea that the producers have an important role to play in the end use of their products. And I'm hopeful that that spirit will infuse the work on these other issues that you just mentioned with regards to glass, bottle bill, et cetera. It also, of course, begs the question on these broader existential crises relating to climate and the use of fossil fuels. I mean, I certainly am encouraged every time I hear an oil company spending more time on research and development in renewable energy. And I continue to hope that they will double down on that effort as opposed to double down on their old, tired, polluting, destructive business model and really help ease that transition, just like we're asking all the producers in the plastics and product space to do. I think just like every example we've been talking about today, from the smog standards to our SB 54, it really does take a conversation with business, but also a commitment on the side of government to act and to push and to not just continue to fall back on the lowest common denominator. To have those conversations with the innovators within the energy space, for example, and to say to those folks in the oil industry who don't want to change, hey, look, those guys are changing. Those guys are doing the next generation of investment. You know, there's so much opportunity here that we could be partners together as we try to create the next generation of jobs and energy development. And unfortunately, as happens always, there will always be groups that will be out there pushing back, dragging their heels. And it takes government and also activists and advocates and all those other groups that are being negatively impacted by the inaction to force the conversation. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so grateful that the governor has come to prioritize this broader climate discussion. I think he recognizes how much of an imperative there is, not only because of the science, but also people all over the country really are frustrated by the lack of action. And I think they're looking to people like the governor with his national profile and the role that California plays in all of this to lead. There's a recognition of the challenges that Washington has to lead in this space. And I think the fact that California can and must play the role that it always has as a leader in this space. And so I'm hopeful that we'll be able to get some really meaningful work done. It's going to be a little messy and complicated, but I really was heartened to hear how deeply committed the governor was when we had a caucus meeting with him. I'm just hopeful that we're going to be able to translate that passion, that commitment that he expressed to us, team it up with the existing leadership and passion and commitment that exists amongst a number of climate champions in the legislature, and I'm certainly aspire to be one of them. I'm a part of that, of a group that's really trying to push the envelope on this existential issue for our planet and for our community. And so, fingers crossed, watch this space. But for all of you out there who care about this, pay attention, weigh in, make sure that your legislators know that you care about this. There are a lot of lobbyists and activists and advocates and industry groups that are going to be spending a lot of time and money trying to protect the status quo, or at least try to lessen the boldness of these proposals. And if legislators feel both the pressure and the inspiration from their constituents to act more boldly, we'll have a much better package come out of this.
Wow, if California was not motivated before, they should be now. Congrats on all the hard work on SB 54 for really being the legislative leader through all of this process. I hope you get some bandwidth and some rest during the interim here, and we will watch this space see what happens in the legislature and even in your own legislative portfolio come the new year. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for your time, and I will say it truly is a team effort. I mean, not just my team, all the stakeholders I mentioned, but also the legislators, many of whom weighed in all sorts of meaningful and important ways, many of whom stretched, many of whom brought in their own perspectives and helped to make this bill better. And I just want to personally thank all of my colleagues in the Senate and the Assembly who came together to support this historic legislation. It really was a team effort.
Indeed. Senator Ben Allen, the chair of the Senate Environmental Quality Committee, thanks for joining us.
Good
to have you.
Thank you.
Then There's California is a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus with technical and production support from Martin Ashley, Bob Brulte, Brian Shadden, McLeana Woods, Ann DeGrazia, Lisa Murphy, Michelle Baker, and the graphic artistry of Tim Davis. On behalf of State Senator Ben Allen, representing the 26th Senate District in Los Angeles County, I'm Brian Green at the State Capitol in Sacramento. Thanks for listening to Then There's California.